became very interested in the interwar period of housing in Bristol that led to the creation of this resource. And there's a lot of information as part of the background information to this is available on Know Your Place. Jenny mentioned Know Your Place a minute ago. And so we've got an interwar information actually added onto Know Your Place as part of all of this. The image you see there, that's not actually Sea Mills, that's actually Shirehampton. And I've put that there at the beginning because what Sea Mills is, you may know, and Mary may have mentioned this, Sea Mills is a garden suburb. And a lot of people think about Sea Mills being, the first garden suburbs in Bristol, which it is. But the very first garden suburb is this in Shirehampton. Shirehampton had the very first garden suburb before the First World War. But I will give you the kind of the story behind that as we go on. Now, this format is not a PowerPoint, it's actually what we call a story map. So I will share, in fact, I'll do that now. I will share in the chat box, or I'll do it at the end. There's I will share this actual resource because it's online, so you'll better go back to this after this talk and read this in your own time. But it just means we can explore this history in quite a dynamic kind of way. The story behind the Housing Act of 1919 it's all about this man here, Christopher Addison. Now, he was a doctor by background, but he was the man behind the creation of what we call the Homes for Heroes Housing Act, the Housing Act of 1919. And it's called the Homes for Heroes Act because it comes from David Lloyd George's speech to Parliament at the end of the First World War, where he said, what this country needs are homes fit for heroes, in reference to the soldiers returning from the First World War, returning from the front. And what he didn't want them to be returning to was these sorts of conditions, these sorts of housing conditions. And this would have been in Bedminster before the First World War. In fact, this is a photograph actually post First World War. But these are the types of living conditions that David Lloyd George and Christopher Addison didn't want our heroes to return to. And so they started to discuss what type of housing would be appropriate for the working classes. So it's actually the housing for the working classes is actually the full name of the act. The reason why I said about looking at this in your own time is because within this story map, as you see here, we've actually embedded oral histories from people who actually have lived in some of these houses. And in this one here, this is Upper Terrace, which is was on Castle Green. And although what you now know as Castle Park was lots of houses and shops before the Second World War, Upper Terrace was actually survived the bombing in the Second World War. And that's an interview with someone who remembers living there in the 1960s. But that's a sort of accommodation that would have been regarded as a slum. And I'm going to say that and give you inverted commas, because these are homes. These are people's homes we're talking about. So the use of the word slum was a very derogatory term that the government was using to say this. We've got to change these way in which people are living. So that's just an oral history there. You better listen to that, like I say, in your own time. So those are the conditions that David Lloyd George didn't want his heroes returning to. Just to give you a little bit of background, Bristol wasn't doing very well for providing homes for all the working classes before the First World War. And a lot of what Bristol was reliant on was the work of philanthropists, and in particular, people like Susanna Winkworth, who in the Victorian period was very active in trying to provide good quality housing for people from the working classes. Before, you would have had nobody taking any interest in providing quality homes. But Susanna actually built the first purpose-built dwellings for working classes on Jacobs Wells Road in the 19th century. The first council houses were actually built before the First World War, at the end of the 19th century. Bristol Corporation reluctantly decided they should build some houses, and in this case flats, for people who are being displaced by some transport schemes, some new roads schemes. And those people were essentially they were clearing slums to put some new roads in, and they needed to rehouse those that population. And I have to say, were reluctant, because before the First World War, the council had only built about 75 actual dwellings for people. So that's, if you think about the housing need that we talk about now, in terms of the mayor has got to build 2,000 homes each year and so on. Before the First World War, the council had only built 75. So that's the kind of puts that in perspective about what's going on before the First World War. But when they actually built the homes, they were very small flats, and they were built in only 4 places around the city. These ones on Chapel Street, which is in St Philip's. And also, when you go onto this, these maps are fully interactive within the actual story map. So you'll be able to go in and explore exactly where that is. So you can zoom in and out on the map, and you can see exactly where that is. This is St Philip's, so you've got Temple Meads up there, and now where that is, it's just industrial estate. So these flats don't exist anymore. And in fact, there's only one set of these houses that still survives. This is another set that were built on Braggs Lane. This is Old Market. This is West Street and Old Market, and that's where the houses were. And then there was another set. The next 2 sets were around the area of Baptist Mill. So this is where Junction 3, the motorway, comes piling in here now. And those were demolished when they built Junction 3 for the M32. And up here on the top left, that's the bottom of Minor Road. Minor Road comes in here. This is the M32, like I say. And these are still surviving on the end of Minor Road. And they're the earliest council houses still surviving in the city. And they were built about 1905, 1906. They're now, they're actually managed by a local cooperative. So they're no longer council flats. They were sold to a cooperative who now manage that, and it's on our local list. So there's a part of the city we're really keen to retain, because they're the only ones that survive from this phase of council house building. The other thing the council did do was to build this lodging house for working men, and that is in St Jude's. That still stands. And it's Samuel Loxton who drew the image of the house, the building there. They also did some lovely drawings of the interior of the municipal lodging house. But in terms of actual significant housing, I mentioned Susanna Winkworth, but the Shirehampton Garden Suburb is really the earliest attempt to actually provide housing for the working classes in a meaningful sense. And I say that because what is actually being built in Shirehampton, it's picked out in colour on the screen here. There's an aerial view. So this is Passage Lees in Shirehampton. The railway station is just off the screen to the bottom of the screen there. Now, these houses were actually built and only part of a much larger development proposal by the Bristol Garden Suburb Company that was set up as it's a private development. It's not council housing. But their intention was to provide a series of cottage homes for workers on land that was owned by Philip Napier Miles, who was the owner of the King's Weston estate. And it's interesting that Philip Napier Miles had already become quite interested in building housing, quality homes for people who were working on his land, but also in Avonmouth Docks and places like that. And so he was exploring these new ways to actually build this type of housing. So also in Avonmouth, around about the same time, again, this is all early 20th century, he's got his architects working on new housing within Avonmouth village itself for the dockers who are working in the Avonmouth Docks. That's the Avonmouth Docks were expanding at that time. But these are probably the most significant because they follow the classic garden suburb principles. Now, the garden suburb principles, that comes from Ebenezer Howard, who was writing in the late 19th century about garden cities of tomorrow. And he was advocating the building of developments that were homes for the working classes or for everybody, that was really about bringing the countryside and town together, uniting the two, so that you would have a cottage-like home with a very decent front garden and a much better back garden within which you could grow your own fruit and veg. The houses will be well spaced apart, and basically he was saying that this was the healthier way for towns to be built. So his garden suburb concepts then get picked up by people like the Bristol Garden Suburb Company, and they start to try and build the kind of housing that Ebenezer Howard was advocating. And Shirehampton is the best example. Well, it's our only example in Bristol of that early phase. So that was built around about 1909 to 1913. The company went bust immediately before the First World War. And then the First World War itself, once that started, that completely curtailed the actual development. So these are the only ones that were actually ever built within Shirehampton. And I suggest if you go for a walk around here, they are really good. If you don't know it, they are really, really gorgeous houses there. They're almost like the Letchworth kind of garden suburb kind of principles, but just on those couple of streets. And it was only 44 were ever built, although it was actually planned for a much wider area of what is now Shirehampton and the actual council estate in Shirehampton, but off to the left of that picture there. Another estate that was built, and this was actually built during the First World War and was largely built on the principles of the garden suburb principles, but it isn't very well known, this one. This is the King's Weston Munitions Estate, and this is still there. If you go to the bottom of Shirehampton High Street and turn right as if you're going to Lawrence Weston, the first group of houses you pass are all part of this munitions estate, and they were built by the War Ministry for workers who were working at the what became the smelter, but at the time was producing mustard gas at St Andrews Road in Avonmouth. And the people who were working, or the men who were working there, their families were living in these houses, just what is now the Long Cross in Lawrence Weston. Again, it's been built largely on the land of Philip Napier Miles. So again, it's reinforcing this connection between the garden suburb concept within Bristol and the landowner at King's Weston House. This is those houses, and if you were on this street now, they look very similar to this, just as they did in here. This is the 1950s, but they look pretty much the same today. Particularly these boundary walls. As you come along the street, you'll see that these rubble stone boundary walls, they're still there. And the other thing about these, they start to, just like the Shirehampton Garden Suburb, introduce this idea of parlour houses. And you'll hear me talking about that in a minute. Parlour houses, essentially, if I was an estate agent and I was selling these houses to you, I would be telling you, these are lovely houses, they have 2 reception rooms. 3 bedrooms upstairs and 2 reception rooms, and that's the kind of type of housing Ebenezer Howard was recommending. And 2 reception rooms, that's a lounge and a parlour. Now, when we've talked to, because we've done a lot of work with communities on in this type of housing, and we talked to them about, well, what does it mean to have a parlour? And these are people who've lived there since the Second World War, say, and they say that's their best room. That's the room they keep for best. So they would sometimes only ever use that room at Christmas. But there was a lot of discussion, particularly through the Housing Act, as you'll hear me talking about in a minute, about how much of the housing should have a parlour. Now, the Labour Party at the time were arguing for parlours to be built into these homes because they felt that it was a way of encouraging the aspirational attitudes within the working classes. You have a parlour, this is a best room, this is where you put all your fine crockery and so on. Whereas other parties, well, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party were really saying that if you have a parlour, it means the houses are more expensive to build. So we have to have a balance. We have to balance that. When it comes to the munitions estate, just coming back to this, you'll see in this text that 40 non-parlour houses were built out of the 100, and 100 parlour houses were built on this munitions estate. So these are workers, they're working on a mustard gas factory, and 100 families have a parlour on this estate, which is, I think, quite interesting that even before the Housing Act, the government, and this is government money paying for these, the government had actually built in these parlours for the workers at the mustard gas factory. Just to give you an indication about what does that actually look like inside one of these houses. This is in the 1950s, but that's pretty much what the scullery would look like. So these houses on the ground floor would have parlour, living room, and a scullery, and that's the tin bath. So no, we're not talking about bathrooms yet in these. So you've got your tin bath there. Then that's your parlour. Now, what's interesting here as well, that's a scullery, really that's a washroom. That's not where you do your cooking. The idea was you do your cooking within the living room or the parlour on the range that was in the living room or parlour. So that's the range that you would be doing your cooking on. And so the idea, I'll come on to the housewife in a minute actually. But just to give you an indication, so that was it in the 1950s before they modernised it. And once it's modernised, it looked like that. So after they did a lot of, because by this point, these are council houses, and the council went through and modernised them, taking out the range, putting in a fireplace, 1950s fireplace, and yeah, made it a bit blander in a way. Right, now on to the actual Housing Act itself. So as I said, in 1919, David Lloyd George made the speech in Parliament saying we needed homes for the heroes. Christopher Addison then introduced the Housing Bill to Parliament, and in which it said the homes that we build for our working classes need to be in accordance with Ebenezer Howard's garden suburb principles. So the homes need to be well spaced out. We can only build a certain number of homes per acre. Every home must have a front garden, must have a back garden. They must have 3 bedrooms. They must have a living room, and some of them would have parlours. And also these places that we're building must have things like tree-lined streets. They must have spaces for allotments. They must have spaces for leisure activities so people can stay fit and healthy. It was all about healthy living. Now, the Housing Act was introduced by the Ministry of Health, and it's a key thing in a way that during the 20th century, that connection between housing and health has gradually been split. Whereas through the 19th century into the early 20th century, there was a really clear connection between the need for housing and the need for good public health. And those two things together mean you get lovely places like Sea Mills and these other places being built, because the overall driving principle is these people need to be healthy. They need to be healthy, they need to have jobs, they need to be able to get to somewhere they can exercise, they need to be able to get somewhere where they can grow their own fruit and veg. So we're really talking about sustainable communities here with these types of places. Once the council Bristol Council actually got itself together with this idea about building healthy, for healthy communities, it really did start to lead the way. And in the early days of the housing being built under the Housing Act, Bristol was probably groundbreaking, and I'll explain why I think that in a second. But even before the Housing Act was actually introduced, Bristol had already bought land out at fish ponds to build up to 1,500 homes. Before they've even got the money from the government, they'd already secured that land, and the Housing Committee had instructed the city engineers to start designing an estate for houses for the working classes that was going to be like a garden suburb. So the very first estate that was built and was being built before the Housing Act was actually introduced was at Hillfields. Now, when I say Hillfields, a lot of people say, where on earth is that? They haven't even heard of it. So we've been working on projects out at Hillfields, and it's actually way out on the very north and northeastern corner of the city. It's just past Fish Ponds, it's just south of Staple Hill, and it's right on the edge of the city. So on this map here, that is the city boundary coming down the outside of that red line there on the right-hand side of that map there. once you're over here, you're in Soundwell, and this is South Gloucestershire over here as it is now. But this estate here at Hillfields, this is our best example of a 1919 Homes for Heroes Act estate. The houses in here on this plan are coloured for the years in which they were built. So the black ones are 1920, the red ones are 1921, and the yellow are 1922, and or yellow or orange, and the blue ones within that red line boundary, which is the extent of the estate, the blue ones are after 1922. In fact, they post-date a later act. So by the time of the end of the act, half of the estate had been built at Hillfields, as opposed to Sea Mills, where they'd only built a few hundred houses. They'd at least built 750 houses out at Hillfields. Now, the most important thing out at Hillfields, and this is where I get really kind of a bit geeky, maybe. I don't know what the actual word is, but the thing about Hillfields, the black houses are very, very, because they were funded directly from central government. So when the actual Housing Act was introduced, money actually went as subsidies to local authorities to build the homes. That means that the actual purse holder was the corporation. In regards to the black houses there, they were funded directly by the government. The government actually paid for those houses to be built with direct funding for those, because what the government was saying is they could see Bristol were actually leading the way in terms of actually having a plan for an estate here, and asked the corporation, we are going to have an international congress to look at how the country is providing homes after the First World War, and they're going to come from all around the country, but also come from other countries, from the Europe, from our dominions, and they need to come over here and be shown the type of housing that Britain are actually going to provide for our heroes. So the central government said to Bristol, we want you to build a demonstration area as a kind of ideal homes exhibition type of thing. And we want you to give us a part of Hillfields to let us build some of those houses so that these delegates can come and have a look at these houses. And that's why those houses in black are built in 1920, because those delegates were arriving in the summer of 1920. So that's the demonstration area in black, and we'll come into more detail about that in a second, because we're going to zoom in on there. So as you zoom in, we just pick out those the black houses there. So early in 1919, the corporation has never built housing like this before. They didn't know how to do it. So the housing committee suggested what we should do was have an architectural competition, the brief of which to say what we want are housing that we can build cheaply, we can build quickly, and will be appropriate for the working classes and built in accordance with Ebenezer Howard's concepts. So they had this competition early in 1919, and on the back of that competition, they chose 10 winning designs, which then were built as this demonstration area. And it means that these houses that were built in the demonstration area are some of the only types of these houses built anywhere in Bristol, in fact, anywhere in the country. So just to go into some detail, that's a drawing of the demonstration area being built. This is Samuel Loxton drawing that in 1920. And so that's the kind of scene that delegates would have been able to see when they arrived here in the summer of 1920. And when those delegates arrived, they arrived at Staple Hill Station and were met at the station by Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, who showed these 500 delegates around Hillfields, took them into these houses, some of which, none of them were occupied by then, but these are the first ones to be occupied. A few weeks after the delegates have been here, people moved into these houses here in about July 1920. So it was June the 5th, 1920, when 500 delegates visited the area, and it was reported in the newspapers. Again, this isn't Samuel Loxton, but it's a drawing of from one of the architectural papers indicating that Essentially, the delegates arrived there, and it's just like working around a building site. It was just full of mud. The roads weren't in or anything like that. But at least they got, the corporation got some responses from the delegates about the type of housing the city council building here. So just zooming in here, the key ones that were built, these ones in black here, these houses, these are the only ones built like this anywhere in Bristol. Now these ones, what's interesting with these were 2-bedroomed houses. And the delegates saw those, and just, you can look at this in more detail later, but this is the actual original architect's drawing for these. And they were designed by W.H. Watkins, who was actually an architect who was designing things like cinemas in the city at the time. He entered the competition, he won with this design, but they have only 2 bedrooms. Now, when the delegates saw those, their response was, 2-bedroomed houses, that's not appropriate for a growing family. You need at least 3 bedrooms. So after that response from the delegates, no other 2-bedroom council houses were built anywhere in the city, except for flats in a later period. So in terms of the interwar period, these are the only 2-bedroom houses on any of the council estates. There are other quirky things that you'll see about those designs, which when you look at this in more detail, you can have a look at. The other designs, there was one other 2-bedroom one that's up there. That's an interesting one because that was designed by Heathman and Blacker. And Blacker, that's Evelyn Blacker, and that's the first female architect in the city. And she is also the architect who designed the cenotaph in the city centre as well. And she designed some of these houses. And these designs, although it's a 2-bedroom version on that site, her 3-bedroom designs ended up being just built on many of the estates around the city. And there's a Clifton and Hotwells Improvement Society plaque to her in Victoria Square in Clifton. I'll just whiz through some of these. So that's our other one. That's a 3-bedroom one, non-parlour. Just to point out within here, though, again, we've got another oral history. This is someone who grew up in this house here and remembers what it was like when he moved in there. She also drew a beautiful picture here looking out of her back garden, what it was like before the rest of the area was developed. And that's her with her sister in the back garden. And when you listen to that, you'll hear her talking about just how privileged they felt to be moving into this house and how lucky they were. They felt really on the privilege to be here in what effectively was the countryside. And it was just a fantastic place to grow up. Now this is an interesting one. This is semi-detached. So quite often, although I've just shown you some areas where these short terraces, the bulk of housing that was built in this period was semi-detached. And this semi-detached pair, that's the only pair of this type built anywhere in Bristol. Again, it's an indication of how this is an experimental phase. And this is a parlour type. It's a very big parlour type, lots of roofs, tiles there. And that starts to give you an indication about why that wasn't built anywhere else, is because the cost of building that was just prohibitive. And so they just, although it's a very nice design, very arts and craftsy, but if you want to build 15,000 homes for the working class, you're not going to build it like that because you won't be able to afford it. The idea was you were going to build homes that was going to cost you around about the region of £800 per unit per house, £800 to build. That one cost nearly £1,000 to build. And so that made it very prohibitive. This is another oral history here. You listen to that one, and that's actually someone who grew up in a non-parlour house. But even though they were in a non-parlour house and they were a family of 8 or 9, I think it is, they said they never used the lounge. The lounge was their best room, and they only ever spent their family time in the kitchen. And the lounge was just the Christmas room. And so a family of 9, 3-bedroom house, they only live, their family time is in the kitchen, which is just, I find quite incredible. Think about our modern lifestyles. That's this is one, another parlour house. This is one that you will see time and time again. So part of what they're doing is experimenting different types of designs, trying to find the standard house type they can build everywhere. And because of the price for this one, when you see parlour houses on these estates elsewhere, none of these actually in Sea Mills. I've never seen anyone these in Sea Mills, but other estates like Southmead or Knoll, the parlour houses will be this designed by Mr. Wakefield. Oh, just because a lot of people say about the plaque in Hillfields, this is actually commemorating the actual building of these homes, and this is the plaque on Beach and Drive. These are more Watkins homes, these are parlour ones, and the plaque is there. And although it says these are the first ones built under the National Housing Scheme, our research has shown that actually the first ones to be occupied were these ones up here on the corner of Briarway and Thicket Avenue, and the Beach and Drive ones was a few weeks or so later. But they were probably built, they would have been there, and the delegates would have seen those when they came to visit. Now, like I say, eventually the whole estate was built. One of the reasons why I've coloured those differently, and the blue ones are quite extensive, that's the other half of the estate, is because, as you could probably imagine, it's government funding. And what do governments do with funding? They tend to cut it. And so the first time the term axe was used for a government cut was to do with the 1919 Housing Act. So they had a spending review in 1921, and they decided that councils were being far too free and easy with the money, and that they needed to curtail the amount being spent on these housing. And so they actually had a cut. They had what they call the Geddes. The Geddes was Lord Geddes was doing the review, and he said you should just stop spending the money. And so they have the thing called the Geddes Axe. So the first time the term an axe used to define a cut to government spending was used in 1921, when they cut the money for the building of houses for the working classes. So that means that Hillfields only was half built in 1921. Nearly half built. The yellow ones, I said earlier, they were built in 1922. They're built under contract, existing contracts just being built out. So that's why these last ones in orange were being built out there. The blue ones, they had to wait to build the rest of the estate until a subsequent Housing Act in 1923-24 to allow them to provide subsidies to build the rest of the estates. And that was the case for all the estates the council and all councils were building at this time. In 1921, they had to stop building the homes. Just, I mentioned earlier about how it's not just homes, and that's, I think, again, this is something, I mean, I can say that I work for the council. I can be quite rude about the council, I think, as long as you keep it between us. I think there's quite often we lose sight of the fact it's not just about homes. Communities need more than just homes. And so you need these community facilities. Now, they didn't get it right either in 1919. Even though there were some community facilities being introduced into some place like Hillfields, like the recreation ground here. And this is the recreation ground. This is a group of boys who've just finished a football game on the recreation ground in 1922. The recreation ground is here. But there weren't anything like the community centres or churches. The school wasn't built to about 1925, 26, and that's the same for Sea Mills. And so actually these communities coming out here, rarely having anywhere to work, rarely having anywhere to be able to go to school, not having those community facilities, and your nearest church would have been down on Lodge Causeway, which is down here. And it wasn't until much later that they started to introduce churches. Even though the sites were laid out ready for a church to be built, the St. Bede's Church here, which is now gone, demolished, St. Bede's Church there wasn't built until the later 1920s. There was a Baptist church built there in about the later 1920s. And the school, like I say, wasn't built till about a similar sort of period. So it was pretty much not a lot happening on here apart from the homes. And the community here, they built their own community centre. And this is a recurring thing you hear about when people want community centres in these sorts of places, the community have to do it themselves because local government aren't going to do it for you. And the Hillfields community actually, because there were people who do plastering or bricklaying, they built their own community centre. And that's a community facility that, although it doesn't look like that anymore, it is still a community hub by the recreation ground where they originally built that community centre. And you go to even post-war estates, you'll hear similar stories. So just to go on to what the other estates, and this is where I come on to Sea Mills. So that's just to put game. This is where Hillfields is, up here in the northeast of Bristol. So the other estates built at that period. So I mentioned Shirehampton Garden suburb, but in 1919 they also introduced some temporary housing, which I'll show you in a second what that means, up here in Shirehampton. They introduced Sea Mills, which I'll talk about in more detail in a second. And they also built a couple of very small estate here on St John's Lane in Bedminster and Knoll Park. Now, when I say they built, like I said before, the only ones where they had actually made a lot of progress was Hillfields and the Shirehampton temporary homes. Sea Mills had progressed a little bit. Knoll Park, they'd only built about 50 houses in Knoll Park, and it was until after 1924 did that get completed. St John's Crescent was largely completed by 1922. So just talk about the Shirehampton temporary homes very quickly before I get on to Sea Mills. They were actually built, and this is something else I did some research into, is the remount depot at Shirehampton. You've probably seen they've just put in or will be putting in a memorial to the horses that went through Shirehampton and Avonmouth docks in the First World War. So as well as the horses, there were lots of soldiers were based at Shirehampton in huts like these, and the corporation bought 70 of those huts and converted them into 140 homes for communities to live in those huts. And so this is how they were reported in the paper. You can see those huts, very similar to the Loxton drawing I was showing you a second ago. And again, we've got an oral history of someone who remembers growing up in one of these huts. And they look very much, it's almost like a very early prefab kind of concept. These are corrugated iron huts, tin sheds essentially. And this woman talks about it being very, very cold in one of these with a very small heater, but a happy childhood within there because it was like being in the countryside. So Sea Mills, let's get on to that finally before we wrap up. Sea Mills itself, it's actually said in the paper when it was first announced we were going to build, the corporation was going to build an estate at Sea Mills, and talks about the first garden city started. And it's the reason why Sea Mills gets a lot of the headlines is because this is where Dr. Christopher Addison actually came and planted the tree at Sea Mills Square. And so that set the ball rolling in terms of the corporation building these estates. And that is why Sea Mills, one of the reasons why Sea Mills gets a lot of the attention. The other reason why it gets that attention is because of the way in which it's designed. It very much is a garden suburb, although Hillfields has these sweeping crescents as well. These crescents and these avenues of tree-lined streets. It's what the Letchworth for your typical Ebenezer Howard type of development, much closer than somewhere like Hillfields, arguably. What was interesting about Sea Mills in terms of what they were doing in 1919, 1920, and the delegates came here as well to look at the housing and what the progress that was being made. And this is Sylvan Way, being built in May 1920. And what they were doing in 1920, because Hillfields had a brickworks just down the road, so they had lots of access to the building materials. It was easy. Sea Mills, there's no brickworks here. So the challenge is, how do we build homes quickly here where we don't have the materials that we need? And so they went to a form of building which steel framed housing with concrete panel walls. And that was the first group of houses in Sea Mills were built in that way, using a London builder, London architects and builder, Dorman Long, who built these homes around Sylvan Way and Woodleys and some of these other parts of Sea Mills down the southern end of Sea Mills. And people have since then this period, I think you may have heard stories about some of the homes in Sea Mills being struggling because of that type of construction, and you actually have reinforced concrete and the rust that happens with the steel work, and it blows the concrete. And so some of these frame houses did have structural problems that the council then had to sort out in the 1990s. There's a drawing of them being built. This is part of the report on the delegates visiting Sea Mills. And a nice picture of the men working actually building the houses as well, which we were lucky to receive. This is a bit later. This is part of essentially with Sea Mills, it's this bottom half of the estate was built before the Geddes, or some of it was built before the Geddes Acts. And then this top end of the estate was built after 1924, just similar kind of half and half. And so the second half of the estate was built up here. This is 1927, this photograph, and these are much more brick built, traditional style housing that's built on the rest of over Sea Mills. That's the square as it was in the early 20th century. The tree is actually out of the picture onto the left there. But in many ways, other than the fact you got trees are now matured, you could stand there and it's not dissimilar. You haven't got the railings anymore and the phone box has changed. But the housing itself, the Methodist church there, yeah, the bus has changed, but that's the picture today. That's that same site. So there's the phone box where Mary's got her museum now. And there's the Methodist church there, and this is the Addison Oak on the actual square there. Just very quickly on Knoll Park. This is another drawing of Knoll Park and St John's Lane. This is actually St John's Lane, the house is being built there. Nice aerial view, or again, typical garden suburb type layout, but in a state that many people don't really think about. And yet most of Knoll Park, they are all parlour houses, whereas Hillfields ended up about 50-50, and the same as Sea Mills. Knoll Park is almost 100% parlour houses. And so where Knoll Park, and you have what we now know as Knoll West and Philwood, once you've started building Knoll West and Philwood in the later phases of housing development, they're building non-parlour houses at Knoll West. Knoll Park is, people who could afford to live in those houses. Because don't forget, once you've built a parlour house, that's a higher rental. So most people actually, once they started to look and being able to select what houses they were going to be moving into, they would choose to move into a non-parlour house quite often because of a lower rent on those houses. Just to give you a very quick run through before we finish, the later phase, as I mentioned, in 1924, they introduced the Wheatley Act. Although there was a Housing Act in 1923, a lot of that emphasis was on giving subsidies to private developers to build housing. In 1924, the Wheatley Act actually introduced new subsidies for councils to build. So in addition to completing estates like Hillfields and Sea Mills, the council were also able to progress with Hallfield that they had planned in 1920, but had not got anywhere near developing any of Hallfield. So that's Hallfield up there, which is just behind, to the right of the Gloucester Road, to the east of Gloucester Road. The other estates were down here, Bedminster Down. And the reason I'm showing you this is just how much housing was built on the back of these housing acts. So there's Knoll West and Philwood and some of Bedminster. Little outliers in East Bristol, in Whitehall and places. They rebuilt Shirehampton. So those temporary huts were replaced by the brick buildings you now see at Shirehampton. So if you get off the railway station at Shirehampton and turn left out of the off Station Road, you end up in a lot of brick built houses, and they're the houses that were built in 1926 to replace the temporary huts. St Anne's Park, and that is actually an estate that was built for residents who were living in the slums of the Dings, and they were rehoused in St Anne's Park. And finally, Southmead, where we've been doing quite a lot of work with the community up there. Southmead's in two halves. You've got the interwar estate here that was built in about 1931, and then north of Greystoke Avenue, you have a post-war estate as well, which isn't, I haven't picked out in colour on this map, but it became one of the larger estates as a result of that post-war building. But that gives you an indication of the amount of housing that's being built in the interwar period. That's all council housing. Of course, 50% of that is now in private ownership because of right to buy policies. But that is what was intended to be built between 1919 and 1939. I'm just going to zip right to the very bottom of this, because if you go through this, it will actually go through a lot of the other types of housing that was built in that period, like the flats that were built in St Jude's and places. This gives you an indication of some of those estates and how they are split between parlour houses and remaining council houses. And what I was trying to show with this graph, I was trying to suggest that where you've got an estate that's predominantly parlour houses, there's been a lot more a take-up of the right to buy policies. And so you have here Knoll Park there. So the total number of houses in blue that was built in that estate, and the red are all the parlour houses. You see, it's not 100%, but it's a high proportion. And you've only got a very small proportion of the Knoll Park estate that are still council houses. That's shown in green. As opposed to somewhere like St Anne's Park, where you've got a few more council houses, or somewhere like Southmead, where there's still more than 50% of the estate is council owned. The same could be said, this is Bedminster and Knoll in here, around about 50% of the Knoll estate is also still council owned. And this is a map of the whole of the city, just to finish off with. And this just shows you the interwar estates are shown here in orange. The post-war estates are in blue, the darker blue. But the pinky, purpley colours, these are all private developments, private housing that were built in the interwar period, some of which will be Stoke Bishop, where you are, and Sneyd Park, but also Henleys, place like this. So it shows that from 1919 onwards, all this coloured stuff, where it had all been fields, that's where all of Bristol's growth was, either from 1919 to 1939, which is the orange and purple, or it's the darker blues, which is the post-war council estates. So it just shows you just what an impact that government funding, if you ignore the dark blues, if you just look at the orange and the purple, that a lot of that is government funding, government investment in housing for the people of Bristol. I'm going to finish with that. This just shows you, it gives you an indication of how Bristol was performing. And in some ways, like I say, we did very well at the beginning of the period, but by the end, we were performing at like averagely when you compare it to other cities. And cities like Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, they provided far more homes for the working classes in this period, between 1919 and 1939, than Bristol did. I mean, I know they're bigger cities, but they did do a lot better than we did. And I'll stop at that. I'm happy to answer any questions. Hopefully that's just a real big fast run through. There's lots and lots more information there, and I'm very happy to share the information.
I think they want to talk.
She can stop that.
Ask him to stop screen share.
Thank you very much, Pete. Can you hear me?
I can.
Right. Thank you very much. You can take your screen away now. Thank you.
I will try and do that if I can remember how to do that.
And I was just amazed how much council building there was as well.
Yeah.
I know, I was surprised looking at old photos to realise that actually a lot of C Mills was built before Stoke Bishop, as far as the number of houses went. I mean, they...
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we have a question here from Roger Harper, but I need to unmute him before he can hear himself speak, I think, and I want to work out how to do that. Unmute all.
Unmute.
Okay, there you are. You're all unmuted now.
Ask Roger Harper to speak.
So Roger Harper, would you like to ask the question you put on chat?
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My question is in two parts. The first one is, what was the eligibility criteria to occupy the very early council homes? And the second part is, could you just give an illustration of a typical rent, say in the 1920s?
Yeah, so the eligibility, there was a lot of emphasis on ex-service men, but the key eligibility was you had to be working, you had to have a job, you had to be employed. So these weren't homes for the unemployed. They weren't homes for all. They were homes for, and that's the clues in the name, the working classes. You had to be working. So that's the key eligibility criteria. Later, the evidence we've seen is that they were also selecting based on medical grounds. So if you were living in a slum or an overcrowded location and your health was affected, that was a key criteria, as was if you had TB. And if you were in an overcrowded house, you would get a much better chance of getting a home. In terms of the rents, from memory, I should get a rent book here. I had a rent book lying around here. I think you're talking around about, for a non-parlour house, you're talking around about 10 shillings a week, I think, and a parlour house, it's 13 shillings, which is 3 shillings difference. That's quite considerable at that time. So that's the kind of the rentals we're talking about.
Peter had a comment or question or something.
Peter, thanks for your talk. During the 1920s and the 1930s, was there a time when there was a sufficient supply of houses with all this building going on? Was there ever a golden age or golden period where if you wanted a house to live in, that was possible?
I'm guessing that the house building by the mid 1930s, but at that point they moved much more into slum clearance, and so the later Southmead development, for example, most of the later residents who moved into Southmead had moved out from inner city slums and had moved out to North Bristol that way. So in that, it's difficult to actually say, did they still need to build homes? Because there was still quite a lot of slums. I mean, the slums were still a problem in Bristol, and in fact, every city in the country, right up to the 1970s.
Yes.
So
yes.
That kind of need, what Bristol, they said they needed to build in 1919 was Bristol needed 5,000 homes. Now, actually, under the Act, the council only built about barely half of that. And so by 1939, the council built 15,000 homes, plus all the private developments that's also happened. So you're looking at something like 40,000 homes has been built in that 20-year period within Bristol. But there was still, coming out of the Second World War, not just for the bomb damage, there was then another big push, another load of drive to have new homes. So whether they actually ever got to a point where you say, actually, that's it, we can stop building now, we've got enough homes, I doubt it very much, because the population is still rising and so on. So
Thank you.
they probably were quite close in the mid-30s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm. When I was working in South London in the 70s, I do remember an old person saying that in the 1930s, the cost of a house went down, which sort of implies that maybe around there was a lot more than, sounds like there was more supply than demand for a change. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know about that supply and demand at this time. I mean, that's one of the conversations that the government were having is about, if we're putting all this money into housing, how much demand is there actually there, and those sorts of things. So every local authority had to make a case to say, actually, we've done an assessment, a proper assessment. Here's the evidence. This is why we need to build this number of housing. To just say to everyone, I've just put in the chat a link to that story map that I've just been using, so that you can.
Great.
It's just a very short little link that you better copy and paste into any browser. So I was using Google Chrome for that, but anything should do it.
Thanks very much, Pete. And I'll be able to circulate that to everybody on an email if you don't get it down now. That's really helpful. And maybe well, if I don't manage to record your talking, I'll be able to share the link better.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that'll probably be more effective anyway.
You may prefer to read it and listen to me again anyway, because I have a tendency to waffle on quite a lot.
Can you just describe again what these books are? Because it's a new concept to me, and maybe to some other people as well, please.
It's called a story map, and so what I'm trying to do is tell the story of Bristol, but through its landscape change, because I see it's not just about
smaller one,
all the other bits and pieces there. The roads and so on, and so Bristol's landscape radically changed on the back of the Housing Act, both 1919 and after the Second World War. And what I'm trying to do is tell that story of that landscape change.
There's £800
Right from the origins of right from the origins of Bristol, right the way through to today, and looking ahead to what
Just ask
Bristol
people to stop and say you're going to mute.
Hang on a moment, please. I need to mute everybody because I can't hear, but I can't remember now how to mute people. Where? There. Mute all. Right. Pete, please unmute yourself.
He can't hear. He can't.
He can hear me.
Yeah.
And just say it again, because there's other voices and I couldn't actually hear what you were saying. Please.
Yeah. Okay. I'll repeat what I said. So yeah, I'm trying to tell the story of the landscape change in Bristol, right from the very early phase when the Bristol Bridge was built, right through to the building of houses after the First World War or the Second World War, building of roads, new roads and so on, like the M32. So essentially, where every time there's been a radical landscape change, I want to build that into a chapter in one of these resources. Now, this is a story map, what we call a story map, and it means that you can embed maps and you can embed videos or audio within the online presentation and have links out. So there are links within the story map out to, I mentioned Know Your Place earlier, links into Know Your Place. So it means you can have live links, live referencing within a chapter. So it will eventually be 12 chapters, which will be an online book, essentially, from one website, which you better get into each of the chapters. It will all make sense eventually when I've written it all. But
I think I've come across some of them before, but sort of never always thought, well, I'll come back to that later. Has anybody got any more questions? And you're allowed to wave your hand or something, and I'll let you in there. Martin wants to speak. How do I unmute him? There you are.
Click on unmute.
You can actually unmute yourself.
Yes, I've just done that. I just wanted to say how very much I enjoyed the talk, and thank you very, very much indeed. I grew up in the sort of area around Hillfields. I went to school at Speedwell Comprehensive School. It was a bilateral, in fact, in those days. So I played a lot with friends who lived on that estate, and that's clarified things so much in my own mind. But I'm also fascinated by the way in which that development was taking place on the outskirts of the city, and then the private development was then filled in all the other bits, as it were. So I've had it absolutely riveting. Thank you very much indeed. But I cannot find the link which you said you had posted somewhere.
I put that in the chat. So if you go to the bottom of the screen, it says chat.
Yes.
And in there it says from me to Jenny Week. Oh, I've sent it privately, so that was my mistake.
Okay.
Ah, yes. I looked under chat and I couldn't see it.
Yeah, that was my fault because I only sent it to Jenny. So
okay. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well
I can share that actually, can't I? Or Pete can. I don't know quite how.
Yeah, type this copy into that.
No, I wanted to. Where's all?
Ruth Myers' thing. So all.
Where's all?
Everyone in meeting, the top pick.
I meant to do it to all. I don't know why it only went to you, Jenny. I don't know. It's my fault.
There you are. I've done it. I've done it. Or rather, Pete has done it. I couldn't do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyway, we're learning. We're getting better at the technology. Has anybody else got a question, please? I must say I find. Oh, Liz, there we go. Can you, Liz? I think you can unmute yourself, or else I can unmute you. Why doesn't it unmute?
Click on it.
I'm okay now, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Peter. That was all very interesting. How do we get what you've talked about up on YouTube, is it, or on some other program to read it through?
Well, I think Jenny was going to put the recording on YouTube. I think Jenny was going to do that.
Right,
and then the link that Jenny has just sent, and then Jenny, I think, was going to email it to everyone again anyway. That's a link to this web resource, this story map that you will then be able to open. By clicking that link, it will open in your internet browser, Internet Explorer, or whatever it might be. And you'll better scroll down like I was doing there. All I was doing was scrolling down, and the different maps and text and images will come up onto the screen as you scroll down. As if you're reading a news item on BBC webpage or something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, you don't need any special app or anything. It's all very easy.
Yeah.